I've been doing YouTube specifically in the PC building space now for over 13 years. Wow. Anyway, and a lot of stuff has changed in that amount of time. So I figured I'd do a video today kind of talking about the good old days and where we are today and what exactly has changed in the meantime. This only might be interesting to anyone that's kind of new to the PC space, but trust me when I say a lot has happened in the last decade alone.
Hey, Jay. Jay. Jay.
What?
We got work to do.
Yeah, I'm playing World of Warships. Yeah. World of Warships is the free-to-play naval strategy game where you command the most iconic and famous warships from World War I and World War II, recreated with stunning detail and accuracy. Build your fleet while participating in various game types while upgrading your ship's arsenal along the way. New players who sign up using my link below will receive an exclusive starter pack to get you up and running quickly by receiving 7 days premium time, 1 million credits, 300 doubloons, and the Tier 5 premium ship, the Exeter. So what are you guys waiting for? Start sinking ships with World of Warships by heading to the description below and getting your freebies. So we're gonna kind of go through each component and sort of talk about how much things have kind of changed. We're gonna kick that off obviously with CPUs. So I've got a couple of samples here of CPUs. Oh man, this is one of the areas where I think things have gotten extremely confusing for new builders and buyers though specifically because unless you go all the way back to like the Athlon XP era, Intel has been on top and just dominated across the board until recent years with the popularity of Ryzen. But the CPUs were smaller, there were smaller core counts, hyper-threading was still newish kind of at the time, but things were much more simple. Like when it came to Intel, you had your i3, your i5, your i7, and you had maybe 2 SKUs of each one of those, which was usually a K SKU for overclocking and a non-K SKU for non-overclocking. And the highest tier model was like a 4-core, 8-thread type of CPU. And I remember back then it was like, whoa, you have 8 threads? What's it like to have an i7? Now fast forward to today and you can have well over almost 200 cores, technically, threads, in a consumer grade CPU. But it carries also a non-consumer grade price of like $5,000+ up to $10,000 depending on the SKU that you get. But these are just absolute monsters of thread capability. So, but now the crazy thing is I talked about Intel being on top for so many years, like the 7700K was king when it came to CPU, 8700K was like meh. 9700K and 9900K were just like the top dogs when it came to gaming. Those were the CPUs to beat. They were the first CPUs to really be able to ship with 5 gigahertz out of the box. I mean, people thought 5 gigahertz was never gonna happen, like that was impossible. Now we are like scraping 6 gigahertz on almost all consumer models, including AMD. This is the 9800X3D, which is just over 5 gigahertz. It actually is about 5.2 to 5.3 gigahertz. But the 9950X on single thread can actually go up to 6 gigahertz. So not only have we broken the 5 gigahertz barrier, we've done it by having 32 threads. That is just crazy to think about. I mean, we are talking four times the amount of threads as the traditional king of the past. So when it comes to CPUs though, unfortunately, that's kind of created a lot of confusion because you have now with that much core scaling, whether you're talking about performance cores and efficiency cores on Intel, or you have your 3D V-cache CPUs on AMD that have different CCDs with different core frequencies and such, those all scale anywhere from still 4-core, 8-thread, all the way up to, for Intel specifically, what, 24-core, 32-thread? And AMD having 32 threads now. And then you can scale that down in a bunch of chunks at a time. So now you have way more SKUs than we've ever had. We have up to i9s, now we have Core Ultras. It's starting to get a bit confusing. Now you kind of have to make your CPU choice based on what exactly you're planning on doing. Is it just a gaming PC? Is it a work PC? Is it gonna be both? And it kind of leads to a lot of confusion. But that's also kind of exciting to see how far we've come when it comes to the silicon quality and how much they've been able to actually shrink the process to fit more of those cores and threads inside a package that honestly hasn't grown by a lot. Now, obviously, when you talk CPU, you gotta talk about memory as well. So memory has changed quite a bit. Obviously, I remember when SD-RAM was the thing. I'm like, I added 16 gigabytes. Well, no, I can't even think, 16 megabytes of SD-RAM. Anyway, moving on, DDR3 was huge, DDR4 was huger because it was one more than 3. No. And then DDR5 is obviously where we are now. But man, back with DDR3, I mean, we were talking 1833 megahertz was like the speed. That seemed incredible. Because I mean, 1333 was kind of what we were used to, and we were getting up to 1833, 1866, sometimes crossing 2000, but support for that on the CPUs and the motherboards was kind of hit or miss. But the RAM was also extremely small, like where you were getting anywhere between, you could have a 1 gig stick, you could have 2 gig stick, 4 gig stick, and if you were baller, 8 gig sticks. But now we're talking about huge capacities where you can go all the way up to 64 gig sticks on consumer grade without an issue. Or if you're talking about consumer grade ECC, if you're doing workstations and such and running like Threadripper or Threadripper Pro, now you can have 128 gig sticks. It's absolutely insane. But not only did the capacity increase, the speed along with it. I mean, now we have CU DIMM on DDR5, and that is for clocked DIMM. And it's crazy because now we're talking 8400 megahertz, 10,000 megahertz. I think some brands are even pushing 12,000 megahertz now, which is absolutely insane. So not only can you get incredible capacities, you also get insane speeds to go along with it. So it's just crazy to think about how far RAM has actually come. And if you're gonna have a very fast CPU, you are going to want to pair it with fast RAM because you don't want that to become your bottleneck. Now, what I'm showing you right here was actually considered a high-end motherboard back in 2012. This is actually a 970FX, not even a 990, you could have gotten 990FX, but this is a 970FX performance, as you can see, Fatality Edition from ASRock. This was a baller board. It had all of the overclocking features, it had all of the RAM, do that again. It had all of the overclocking features. It had the faster chipset stuff. It still had a PCI slot, which is kind of funny. AMD held onto the PCI slot even through some of the early Ryzen era, which is kind of weird. But anyway, obviously supported SLI, supported Crossfire. This in here right now is my 8370FX processor, which was like crazy back then. I never went with like a 9550 or 9950 or, wait, do we go full circle? But the highest end CPU you could get back then from AMD was actually the 9590, which was the first consumer CPU that advertised being shipped at being able to touch 5 gigahertz. Unfortunately, the process was kind of slow and old and still built on Bulldozer and Excavator and all that and just did not perform that great, which is what led to Ryzen today. But this, we're talking, it was like a $200 board. And back then people were like, oh my gosh, who would spend $200 on a motherboard? Because $80 boards, $90 boards, that was all you needed. Enter today, these guys. And I'm not just Asus, but motherboard brands in general have just started to increase the cost slowly and exponentially over time. Big beefy VRAM coolers, as you can see, LCD screens or OLED screens built in, quick release like M.2 covers and crap. I thought this one is quick release. Oh yeah, wait, there we go. There, quick release M.2 coolers and such. Weird retention systems to hold down graphics cards, armor on the back. It's kind of funny, one of the reasons why this became a thing was if you look at some of the, ow, poked.
I told you, right?
I picked that up by the
old ones hurt more.
By the pokey, well, obviously all the parts are placed down and then soldered on the backside. So some of those solder joints and the parts that poke through the PCB could be a little long. I think I'm gonna start bleeding here in a second. And sometimes they could touch a case and cause grounding issues or short issues, and then you would start having stability issues, or sometimes the death of parts because of the back of the motherboard touching things. So stuff like this started getting introduced just to make sure that could never happen. Other than that, it doesn't really serve a purpose. You can't see it. It doesn't actually cool anything on the backside. It's just sort of a layer of protection between the motherboard and the rest of the board. But anyway, things got extremely expensive, obviously, with more robust chipsets, more M.2 slots, more features built in, 10G NIC, Wi-Fi 7 built into motherboards now. Like Asus is known to have like their DIMM.2 stuff, which would put the NVMEs up closer to the CPU in a more direct lane, but this board doesn't particularly have it. Multiple USB-C ports, multiple USB 3 ports, 75 fan headers, you know, crap like that, which is how you get motherboards that cost over $1,000 today. Which in the era of this guy would have been the cost of the entire tower at $1,000. So when it comes to coolers though, you have to use your imagination. This one isn't actually that old. This is the Fantex 240 MPG, or MPH, the miles per hour, we like to call it. It's a 240 AIO, it just fits two 120 millimeter fans. I show this because this would have been considered pretty standard, if not big for the time. 360s didn't exist. 120s are what most people were putting on their CPUs, and they would plug them into the back exhaust fan area and leave regular fans on top of their case. But there was only a handful of players out there. Most of them were either running some sort of an Exeter rebrand, because Exeter had the patent for the whole like pump on cold plate design. You had the Corsair H100, which is extremely popular back then. No RGB, none of that. It just literally, like this guy, had a single cable that plugged into your motherboard and it was controlled off a regular fan header. So when 240s came out, like the joke kind of was, I think Phil said, whoa, you must have an i7, you know, because you would need to cool 100 watts, which back then seemed like a lot. One thing we forgot to mention on the CPUs is those guys like that Threadripper can pull well over 600 watts from the socket. Anyway, so this doesn't really cut it that well today. I mean, yeah, you can run modern CPUs on a 240, but air coolers have improved too, to the point to where they kind of made the 240 obsolete. But Intel entered the chat and said, hold my 253 watt beer and see how well you can cool this guy. Well, that's why companies like Arctic have come out with these chunguses. This is a 420 millimeter by 47 millimeter, I believe, thick radiator. This guy's just a friend, she swears. This is you over here like... But the thing is, this is not that uncommon now. More brands are starting to support 420 millimeter radiators, which is three 140 millimeter fans, because of the increased power and heat that modern CPUs are generating. Even a CPU like the 9800 X3D, which is only about 130 watts, there's more to the story than just the watts the CPU pulls to actually be able to control the heat. And you want to keep something like the 3D V-Cache design as cool as possible, so you definitely want to step your cooler up to the biggest cooler you could fit in your case, in my mind, because of the fact that there's no such thing as too much cooling, but there's definitely such thing as too little. So to see, I wish I had a 120 to compare it to, because I'm telling you, 120, it was like the H50i is what the Corsair was at the time. They cost about 70 bucks back in the day, and that was all most people needed. And they were better than almost any of the air cooler designs that were out. Sans Noctua, because Noctua has been around a long time, but they were always very expensive. So most people would go, well, if I'm gonna spend that kind of money, I'd rather get a water cooler. But the water coolers too, they didn't have the lifespan that air coolers did, because air coolers had no moving parts. They just had the fan and that was it. They don't tend to wear out as long as you don't put any holes in the heat pipes or the vapor chambers. So you can just change the fan if that ever started to rattle or start to go bad. AIOs have gotten more reliable over the years though. Back in the day, there was no way to refill them, there was no way to service them. In fact, back then they were doing a pretty terrible job of filling them at the factory as far as I was concerned, so they were starting to prematurely die after about 2 to 3 years at the most. But now a lot of AIO companies are starting to include fill ports and actually support being able to keep it topped off over time, as some of the fluid will evaporate through the tubing no matter what material that you use. It's just, as Malcolm said, nature finds a way. Okay, so let's talk about storage. 10 years ago, if SSDs were a thing, SATA SSDs, but most people were still running some sort of a spinning platter drive, whether we're talking about 5,400 RPM, 7,200 RPM, or if you were super rich and super baller, you might have had a 10,000 RPM Raptor drive. Or you had two of those in RAID, which was just insane, because you could have gotten something like 500 megabytes a second of read-write. That is crazy for a spinning drive if you think about it. And then SATA SSDs came in. 2.5-inch drive, about the same exact size as a notebook model, and they made them that size so they could be supported in notebooks. But these had capacities that started in the gigabytes. 128 gigabyte, 240 gigabyte. This is a 480 gigabyte Crucial model right here. This is the BX500. The only issue with the SATA 6 gigabit per second is the fact that it capped out at right around 550 megabytes per second read speed. And that was the limitation of the interface itself and the entire SATA platform and the way that it was able to transfer data. That 6 gigabit, the 6 gigabit per second was the limiting factor, not necessarily the NAND or the controller on board. But the capacities continued to grow and grow and grow. And you could get SATA drives up to 4 terabytes even in recent past. But you had to have a big clunky power connector going to it. You had to have a SATA connector going to it. The plastic on SATA connectors, on SATA drives, are fairly brittle. So if you mounted it in your system, you start cable managing and you pulled too far on it, it'd easily snap it. And it really kind of sucked. And trust me, as somebody that's done that multiple times, I then would have to get it lined up just right so it works and then like tape it down so it couldn't move. I've broken plenty of SATA connectors on accident just by getting a little bit too handsy in the install process. But if you had a SATA drive 10 years ago that was an SSD and it was anything over like 480 gigs or even a terabyte, that was just, you were spending big money on your system because you were like pulling out all the stops. Now this right here is a T500 Crucial Gen 4 NVMe SSD. It's a 2 terabyte variant. You can get them in 1 terabyte, 2 terabyte, 4 terabyte, and they're actually fairly economical given their speeds and their capacities. So this is a Gen 4 and it caps out right around 7,400 to 7,500 megabytes per second. Put that in comparison to if you stepped up from a 550 megabyte per second up to basically 7.5 gigabyte per second on this. There's no power lines you have to run to it, no power cables, no data connection. It goes right into the motherboard. It slots right in the motherboard. That's why we talked about more expensive boards now have lots of slots so you can add more capacity without necessarily having to buy large drives. It is good to get a nice large drive though. But let's say Gen 4 7,500 megabytes per second is not enough. That's why the 705 is pretty nuts from Crucial. I'm actually running one of these in my system. This is the limited edition. It's actually a 14,500 megabytes per second read. We actually did a test on that and you get every bit of that, which is absolutely insane. 14.5 gigabytes per second. This alone, when we talk about how far things have changed in the last decade, this alone is what I feel like wakes people's older computers up more than anything, is by just throwing in an SSD. Even this guy, if you're still running a spinning drive with an operating system on it, think about it. Your system, your Windows install and your drive, and any programs you're running all have to share that needle. That needle that is seeking on that platter to find the data, it has to be shared. And if the data is stored on different parts of that platter, that has to wait until that part of the drive is actually seeked to serve the information that is being asked for by the CPU or the program or whatever is asking for that information. But SSDs are able to do that extremely fast because they are solid state. So solid state drives, in my opinion, are the biggest improvement, the biggest consumer-friendly, forward-facing technology we've seen come out at a price that is very, very, in my opinion, price to performance that makes the most sense. So this right here is actually a GTX 1650 MSI. It's obviously a few generations old. The fact that it even starts with a G and not an R. But you know what? Back 10 years ago, this was the standard size of a graphics card. In fact, the 1650 mid-range, actually entry-level mid-range when it comes to graphics, was more than enough that people needed because graphics games at the time were not extremely demanding. Sure, you had your titles out there like Crysis and other titles that would absolutely just wreck your system if you weren't building one for it. That really came down to poor game engine optimization than it did the hardware. Even some hardware today even has a hard time running Crysis if it's not higher end hardware, believe it or not. Anyway, moving on, the size of the graphics card is pretty standard. It has a single 6-pin PCI Express, which is really cute to think about by today's standards. But you might have slightly bigger models that might have an 8-pin and a 6-pin, 2 8-pin, or maybe even 3 8-pin. This is an RTX 4080, which isn't even the highest end model that we could have grabbed today. As you can see, this is the Strix. It is a bit excessive, if you will. So one of the things that's changed over the last 10 years is how big graphics cards have gotten to try and tame the amount of heat that starts making their way into graphics cards. Now the 4080 is a 320 watt TDP. It doesn't need a big cooler like this. But what a lot of graphics card companies have started doing is because of 4080 and now the new 90 tier cards, and I say new, only the last 3 generations have we had 90 tier cards, right? These used to be called Titan farther back, but now we have the 3090, 4090, 5090 being big, giant, power-hungry cards. Because the 4080 was so close to it in terms of price, they would just design the PCBs to be capable of taking the big cooler and just slapping it on the smaller card to sort of save tooling and manufacturing costs. So this one doesn't actually need to be this size, but I guess we could pretend it's a 4090 or even potentially a 5090, because what this has now done is the last couple generations of graphics card have really led to people needing to upgrade their case because they didn't fit in a lot of cases. So unfortunately, as the heat has gone up, so has the potential of problems. Like we know the melting connector issue that started with 4090 was obviously a disappointing era that is carried over into the 5090 even more so because they upped the power from 450 watts to 600 watts. Yeah, I think the quote that's been used is flying a little too close to the sun, quite literally. And this is really more of a depressing topic on this one because the graphics cards themselves, this is the most exciting part of a gaming PC, the graphics card. That's the part people nerd out over the most. And it's the bragging points, it's all of that. And graphics cards easily give you the biggest impact in your gaming performance. But lately they've been the biggest impact in your wallet and bank account and in potential damage. It's just kind of been a bit of a shit show, unfortunately, and that is where the current state of affairs are regarding graphics. If you haven't noticed, there's been a little bit of a trend in this video, and that's kind of talking about how most things have evolved into more expensive, more grandiose designs that really don't need to exist. Now they all came out of competition, right? Especially when we talked about the leapfrogging of CPUs and the Intel AMD battle, and the way that they were able to scale that up to outdo their competitor is add more cores and add more frequency. And what that means, more power draw, which now brings us into power supplies. But when we talk about power draw and such, it's easy to now have your costs get out of control pretty quickly because now you're talking about needing extra cooling, you're talking about needing extra power, you need maybe a potentially bigger case or more case fans, and then the costs can easily start to get out of control really quickly. But one of the areas I think it's kind of fun to talk about is how small and efficient power supplies have gotten. This is a Corsair HX100 or 1500i. It is a platinum rated 1500 watt power supply. This only exists for us because we have to test cards like the 4090 and the 5090 and all the super power hungry stuff. And no, they don't draw 1500 watts, but the higher end power supplies like this with the high power capacities are usually built to a better standard because that's the way they can reliably deliver that level of power. But SFX power supplies, this is actually a Silverstone 1200 watt platinum SFXL power supply. So to think about the fact that this little guy right here is pretty close to the power of this guy right here, it's nuts to think about. Because for years, the largest SFX power supply wattage that you could typically get was about 500, maybe 550. Then when the 650s came out, we were like, whoa. Then 750 and we were like, what is happening? And then it seems like it shot past the 1000 watt mark pretty quickly and easily because as things progress, the quality and the size tend to shrink, just like the process in a CPU. The capacitors can get smaller, the VRMs can get smaller, the inverters get smaller, which allows the power supplies themselves to get smaller and more reliable, which means higher power capacity. So it's kind of fun to think about the fact that this is a 1200 watt SFXL power supply. And you can get 1000 watt SFX power supplies that are non-L, which are like an inch shorter than this even. So,
Jeez.
Chair's fat shaming you.
Yeah, we found the fat shaming chair.
So it's just fun to think about how small power supplies have gotten over the years. Now this video isn't intended to be all like depressing and such. As PC enthusiasts, it's fun to see things continue to grow and evolve and get more powerful. But unfortunately, with that tends to come a new baseline for the buy-in cost on trying to get into PC gaming. So I would really love it if manufacturers started really trying to focus more so on entry-level quality, entry-level products that are giving us anything low-end today, like even the most bottom-end new CPU today is faster than anything I used 10 years ago. It is crazy how well that's gotten. But the problem is gaming developers and studios, they are developing for, believe it or not, the high end. They're trying to keep their games and their engines as relevant into the future, as far into the future as possible. So usually when a new title comes out, let's talk about like Indiana Jones real quick, it is intended to be forward-facing in technology. So the hardware that exists today may not be able to run it at its highest settings, but it's hardware in the future, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, that will allow you to really be able to crank those settings where once you crank the settings up, it feels like a whole new experience in terms of how good the game looks. Unfortunately, usually by the time that happens, the game's no longer relevant, and people have moved on to the next title, which at this point, I think the one everyone's waiting for that's probably gonna push tech forward again is gonna be GTA 6. But anyway, we won't talk about games right now because that's all speculation moving forward. But I would just love to see manufacturers really start to emphasize the importance of affordability when it comes to their products. They're all so busy over the last decade trying to one-up each other into the high-end space to be the most premium brand, that they're kind of isolating the audience at which bolsters their sales, which is low-end and mid-range. So anyway, that's the most depressing change I've seen over the last decade. A lot of cool stuff's come out, but unfortunately it leaves a lot of people behind when it comes to the affordability and availability of the parts and stuff. And don't even get me started on 50 series availability. We all know how that's gone. So this is where I ask you guys down in the comments below. If you've been in PC and PC gaming for, let's say, 5+ years, anything beyond 10 years would be awesome. I personally been doing gaming PC for about 30 years right now. So it would be interesting for you guys to put what you think has been the best thing you've seen happen and the worst thing you've seen happen. I feel like they could almost be the same thing, like I said. Huge performance gains, but huge cost to go along with it. Ideally, we'd love to see those huge gains at the same cost, minus inflation.